said this: "For a few hundred years or so, we've been looking for answers to most of life's questions from science and materialism. But we've been mostly disappointed because, it appears, questions that come from the heart can only be answered by knowledge that the heart has accumulated." There's a woman in Great Britain who was raised Catholic, and she's always very much involved and she was always very much interested in religion. And so she took being a Catholic as a kid very seriously, and she went to school and she studied and she did all the rituals and the rites, and she learned everything she needed to learn, and she learned a lot about Catholicism. And she talked about the idea that she loved to go into the church sometime when no one was there and to sit and just feel the presence of the church. And she loved physically being in the church and physically being in services. As she grew up and she became a teenager, she began to find that Catholicism didn't quite take her where she wanted to go. So on her own, she began to explore a little bit and read some things. And ultimately, when she was old enough to start sort of a college situation, she took some classes. And she began to explore beyond Catholicism. And she found her way into Wicca, which, as most of you know, is a form of, Wicca was designed by Gerald Gardner back in the early part of the 20th century as bringing forward pagan ideas and those ideas and old folklore and witchcraft and things like that. And so she embraced the pagan ways, and she got herself involved in a coven in Great Britain, a small coven, mostly women. It was a small group of women, and they practiced together. And she continued on with her, what she called her religious and spiritual studies. In fact, some of the women in the coven really encouraged her even more than she was encouraging herself to do this. And she began to incorporate some of what she loved about Catholicism into her Wiccan practices and rituals. And she explored some Eastern ideas. She continued to reading. Whenever there was a lecture by someone from the East or whatever, she would attend, and she would take in as much information as she could. And so using Wicca as her spiritual practice, her rituals, and also bringing in some Catholicism, and especially in terms of Wicca, Wicca is one of the cornerstones of Wicca is to definitely honor the spiritual ancestors. And so for her, there were several saints in the Catholic group that she really loved, and she looked at their attributes and she looked at what they brought forward. Wicca very much talks about the divine feminine, and so for her, she grabbed a hold of the idea of Mary, and that made a lot of sense to her. And so Mary became her idea of the goddess. So she went along and she talked about the fact that she was a seeker, and she loved the idea of being a seeker. And I know that she has that in common with a lot of us who find ourselves in our tradition, that we are seekers. Because seekers, as you know, what that's about is to gather as we go along. As we seek, we gather. We gather ideas, we gather information. So along the line of her travels, along her journey, she began to develop some very strong personal spiritual ideas. She developed a very strong belief in reincarnation. She internalized a very strong belief in the connection that we have with universal spirit, and that there is this energy of God that is all around us. And I think that's interesting in listening to her talk, that there's something Ernest Holmes said that I think that she would completely agree with. Ernest Holmes said, "The great mystics have all taught a simple truth. There can be no salvation outside of conscious cooperation with infinite law. God is for us, whatever our conception of that infinite creative force may be." So, in the meantime, she raised a couple of kids, and like like all kids, they looked at their mom and thought she was kind of nutty and kooky and rebelled against her. Just like it doesn't matter if you're a Baptist or a Catholic or a witch or whatever. I mean, your kids are going to rebel against you, And so she had a son and a daughter. And the son, he just thought she was basically nuts and kind of went off and did his own thing. The daughter did too, but of course there was that mother-daughter thing that started happening around when she became a teenager, and so there was those conflicts as well. And so she continued her practices, and she continued her searching and her seeking, and she continued developing spiritual ideas. And she noticed that part of her daughter's rebellion was to basically kind of turn away from her. Turn away in terms of looking out there to the world to find other ideas, whether it was pop culture or materialism or other forms of religion or whatever it was. So she went along and she allowed her children to rebel in their own way, and she allowed her children to do their own thing, and she didn't think much of it. And she was accumulating this information basically for herself. And so if you would have gone up to her and asked her a question and say, why do you do all this? What are you seeking for? It would be, well, it's to figure out my own way of being in the world. My spirituality, my ideas are very personal. They're very private. They're very much my own. While she did practice in a small community, that coven, was to basically reinforce the teachings, to encourage each other, friendships, things like that. One day, when her daughter was about 19 or 20, she found out that she had manifested a form of cancer. And this cancer was very much a cancer that is very life-threatening. And suddenly, this woman found that her daughter, who had turned away from her in the normal rebellion that people do, children do, young people do, and thought she was nuts and whatever. Suddenly she realized that this young woman turned to her, literally and metaphorically, to come home and to look her mom in the eye and say, this is what's going on. And suddenly at that point, there is an openness to those questions that are the questions of the heart. Because she was turning herself over to the scientific world, to the material world. But what was the meaning? What is there to expect? What is housed within that incredible fear that came up? And so suddenly this woman, who was very much on her own quest, on her own search, in her own seeking, found herself in a position to be the one place that her daughter turned, and that they were going to go through this together. And so her spiritual training through Wicca, first of all, called upon her to talk to her daughter and to share with her daughter these deep feelings of the connectedness of the universe. That there is a power greater than we are that we are part of. And that just because she had cancer didn't mean she was outside that power. She began to share with her her deep feelings and connections to reincarnation. Ernest Holmes said, one of his quotes is that the veil between the worlds is incredibly thin. And that's what this woman had discovered as well. That there is literally most of this universe that we cannot see, but it is there. And that there is something greater about us. And that not only are we not defined by cancer, we are not defined by one particular lifetime. We are not defined by anything or confined or defined by anything. Because we are larger than that, because the universe is larger than that. And she began to answer those heart questions with information she had accumulated in the heart. And because of Wicca, because Wicca stresses the ideas of those special gifts of creativity that we have within us, regardless of who we are, much like us in Centers for Spiritual Living. She knew that her daughter loved to draw and to paint, and she knew that her daughter loved to journal, and so she encouraged her to do those things. Don't forget about those parts of yourself. And let's use those parts of yourself. Let's express with those parts. Because there is something larger here to be healed. What is larger? Larger is understanding who and what we are. Larger is defining those relationships, experiencing those relationships, understanding the meaning and the depth of those relationships. And so her daughter ended up doing several paintings, and one of them was a huge tree where the base of the tree comes down, and on one side you see it morph into a young red-headed woman, and on the other side an older dark-headed woman. And that they were joined together by the tree of life, which is also a pagan idea. And so her daughter, who had been so rebellious in a normal kind of way, shows up one day to be the student. And this woman who was simply a seeker to try and figure some things out for herself, her own life, suddenly became the sage. The title that I wanted to give what we're doing today, the elder sage, there's two parts of that. You know, we are all elders. We're all elders to somebody. But are we a sage? There's two parts to that. And this is very important to me because the reason I'm talking about this today, this has been germinating in me for several weeks, going back to the early part of the summer. And I want to speak of something very, I'm going to speak of it very generically. And I want you to bear with me because this is a small community and I don't want to get into any specifics at all. So I'm going to try and share with you where I'm coming from with a sparseness of specifics. There's a young man in this community. I would say he's young. He's about 30 years old now. And I'm a little bit familiar with him because once upon a time he had connections with this spiritual community. And he's someone who comes from, a challenged background, a challenged family background. And it was always so sweet for me. I've been the minister here now for 7 years. It was sweet for me to see the connections he had with a couple of people in our community who really cared about him and who shared with him. He was obviously a spiritual seeker. He was obviously someone with a lot of questions. He was someone who had some very challenged relationships and had already been in his young life down some pretty rough roads. But there were a couple of people in this community who seemed to have a connection to him. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, I get here really early in the morning. I'm here usually by 8 o'clock, and sometimes around 9 o'clock some people kind of drift in. People who, make sure that things are going for the whole day. And every once in a while he would show up around 9 o'clock, and he would just hang out and talk to a couple of those people who showed up early. Not me. I mean, he knew me, he was nice to me, we would talk, but there were a couple people here that he connected to. And I would listen to those conversations. And those conversations were so supportive, so encouraging, so loving. And I heard the spiritual principles that we teach in the center in those conversations. And I heard some other incredibly wise things shared in those conversations. It was always really wonderful. Well, I haven't seen him for a while. And this summer, early in the summer, I was at a farmer's market. We had a presence at the farmer's market every week. And so we have our booth and our table set up and everything. And we're there. And at some point, I walked away from the booth and I kind of went to the other end of the farmer's market to buy something to drink or eat or whatever. And I saw this young man, hadn't seen him in a long time. And I could tell by looking at him, I could just tell by looking at him that he was sort of in the shadow side. And he was surrounded by a bunch of men who were my age or older, who belong to, they are an organized group of people who celebrate life in a very different way than what I would say we celebrate life. And they were encouraging him in terms of how he was living. And I stood back for a while, and I have a very aggressive side to me that I have to watch. It's that old Baptist stuff, I guess. And I wanted to enter into the circle. Not just to say something to him, but I'm going to be really honest with you about what rose up within me was I looked at these older men, and I thought to myself, really? This is all you've got? You can't see the struggles of this young man. You can't see where he's from. You can't draw upon yourself in some way, shape, or form to share something higher. Now, I'm not proud to admit that. That's a very judgmental place to be. And I found myself so sad. But I found myself also with two other thoughts. And one of them is the thought of contrasting what I saw there with what I've seen here. And my experience, having with my incarnation before I became a minister, working with young people, working in the social work area, working in drug rehab and stuff, is that you have no idea how powerful anything you say to a young person is. You have no idea. I have talked to young people who said they were heading home on a bus because there was a pistol in a drawer and they were going to use it. And someone said something to them to the effect of, I really like your hat. I really like your shirt. You seem like a nice person. And they didn't use that pistol. I've heard that story more times than you can imagine. I have talked to young people who grew up in places you can't imagine in terms of the darkness, and there would be a few words from a teacher, a counselor, a friend, somebody's parent, a police officer that they have hung their entire life on. And I think that there's a reason for that, because I think that it goes to the fact that we live in a universe that is grounded in love. And when love comes up, we grab a hold of it instinctively. I don't care how dark your surroundings are, we grab a hold of that idea of love and optimism. What Ernest Holmes said, God is for us. And I think that when we hear that God is for us, I think it resonates in our heart. And I think that in a sea of darkness, that little speck of light, we will grab a hold of it. Because somehow that reminds us that we are home. That the universe, that God, that goodness is for us. And so I stood at this farmer's market thinking about this. And giving whatever energy of goodness I could. You see, there's lots of elders. But who are elder sages? Willing to walk into a situation and say, you know what? There's another way. There's another way. There's something more about you. Let's talk about the truth of addiction. Let's talk about the truth of materialism. Let's talk about the truth of darkness. And let's contrast that with light and optimism and God and spirit and something different, something healthier. And then I was reminded in that situation when I stood there that day about a man who he's one of those people from my background that I will never forget. And he is no longer in this world. He was an older man. And he was a man of very few words. He was a man who had incredible presence. incredible charisma. And when he was a young man, he was a real cowboy. You know, those people who like herded cattle for hundreds of miles to market. He did that. He ended up becoming a person who created tack for horses. I'm talking about like bridles and all that sort of thing. He carried on a family tradition in that, and in fact, his work was so renowned that he had clients like Ronald Reagan and people like that who had his tack with their horses, and he had pieces in museums in this country. An incredibly interesting man. He was married. He never had any children. He and his wife had a wonderful love affair. He owned a huge Lincoln Continental, and she drove him around, and he had a big cowboy hat that filled up the whole car. And I remember him so well because some friends of mine and I had done something really stupid as teenagers, gotten ourselves in trouble, and there was a whole bunch of adults that were ready to take us to the woodshed and basically sort of cast us out. And he was, in his very few words, stepped forward in this group and talked about sometimes what young people do as part of their journey, and that we were all young once, you know? It was one of those conversations. And, well, his idea didn't win out. So he ended up walking out, but I will never forget the fact that he stood up. He stood up for us in very simple words. So years later, I'm in my 20s, and I'm in a laundromat. And I don't want to go into details, but this is a real low time in my life. I mean, I was being my bad self. I was in the shadow, the dark side, all that stuff. And it didn't take a genius. If you had seen me walking around, you would know exactly what I was all about. So I'm in this laundromat, and in walks this guy, because it was probably about this time of year. And his wife sent him to the laundromat to wash all the bedding for the coming winter. And, you know, the stuff that she didn't want, that was too big for her washer. So I was in there, and he walks in, and he looks at me, and you know, we exchanged pleasantries. And he looked me up and down, and he asked me some questions about how I was doing in terms of the creative side of me. The fact that I was an artist, the fact I was going to college at that time. He never said, "Oh my God, what happened to you? What's going on? You look like, you know, four-letter word." He didn't. He went to talking about that creative part of me. It was as if he was saying, "Hey kid, do you remember who you are? I remember who you are. I can look past what I see, and I can remember who you are." Just like the Wiccan woman to her daughter, I can look past this cancer and know who you are. Now let's talk about who you really are. And let's talk about the fact that even when you leave this world, which you're going to do here very shortly, we will always be connected. Because as Ernest Holmes says, life cannot be divided against itself. Relationships don't end, they only change. And so when I saw that at the farmer's market, and I've been carrying this with me for several weeks, is this idea that, you know, yesterday we celebrated the Day of Peace, and we look around the world, we look in our families, we look in our communities, we look at the world, and we say there's a whole bunch of people who are living in a dark way. What do we do with that? Well, I got to tell you, the world ain't going to change until we show up. And I don't mean being an elder, I mean being an elder sage. To begin to share our wisdom. A gentleman by the name of Wayne Kritzberg, who's a writer that I have a high regard for, said, "To hold the responsibilities of an elder sage in the community, we must seize each experience life gives as fuel for our inner search, to seek out spiritual maturity, and offer it to others when the time is right." to offer it to others when the time is right. Like the woman with her daughter, like the older gentleman in my life who, when the time was right. It's not about being a missionary, it's not about proselytizing, but it's about recognizing when the time is right to be something different. And if you can allow me just to be a little bit poisonous here for a moment, those guys who were with this younger man, they were trying to be cool, they were trying to be hip, they were trying to be whatever, but they weren't right. They weren't right. And it irritated me so much. Because I said, that's all you got to offer? Really? You can't look at this young man and see that he is crying out for something else? To remember who he is? Because the time is right. But then I remember that as he is in the world, and I don't know where he is in the world, but as he is in the world, I also know that a couple of elder sages who are here, they've had a shot at him too. And I think at some level that that's going to rise up. Just like it rose up in me. There were many years after that laundromat encounter where I took myself to places you can't imagine. But that stayed with me. That there was someone who was willing to look past the appearance into the truth. Into the truth of the potentiality of who and what I am and who and what everybody is. That there is this incredible spirit that lives within us. Just like the woman who was able to look into her daughter and see a higher truth, and then took on the ability to convey that. And to, the fact of the matter is we are communal beings. That's our evolution. That's who and what we are. We're primates. We need to be together. We learn from each other. We laugh together. We cry together. We've hunted together. We've gathered together. We've learned together. We've experienced each other. We depend on each other. We depend on each other to know the truth of us, to hold us up, and to take on that mantle of the sage. Imagine, the sage. Imagine that beautiful old weather-beaten person, and I say beautiful, covered with the patina of life, the patina of experience, that has that walking staff, and says, come with me. Come with me. Let's walk this journey together. Let's celebrate who and what we truly are. I want to end this morning. There's a piece by Ernest Holmes that I got a hold of, and I reworked it a little bit in terms of sort of a meditative piece. And so to end this morning, I would invite you to, if you're comfortable, close your eyes and just maybe put your right hand on your heart and just allow yourself to come into an open and receptive place for just a moment. I want you to imagine a figure in front of you. A young woman, a young man, a person. Or maybe it's someone in your life. It could be a mother, it could be a father, a sister, a brother. Imagine a coworker. Imagine someone who is troubled, who's forgotten who they are. Imagine for a moment that energy and what that feels like and what that looks like. Looking to you to convey something. To convey something. You have been afraid of the universe in which you live. suspicious of all that is around you, uncertain of the salvation of your own soul. Nature seems to await your comprehension of her. What bondage may appear to exist must be the result of your own personal ignorance, an ignorance of your own divine potentiality. When you learn to trust the universe, to truly trust your highest nature, you shall be happy and well. When you learn to trust the universe, to truly trust your highest nature, you shall be happy and well. When you learn to trust the universe, to truly trust your highest nature, you shall be happy and well. And so it is.